Hello, my name is Emily Crow from The Cozy Crow, and Alfred, we have a visitor who wants to be with me while I do this video. Hello, my name is Emily Crow from The Cozy Crow, and welcome to my YouTube channel, and welcome to this video where I'm going to talk about everything that I read in the month of February. If you're new here, welcome. I like to do these videos pretty much every month to talk about everything that I read. I'm going to give you some statistics that I find really interesting about my reading habits, and then I'm going to jump right into going book by book and talking a little bit about what the book is about, what I liked or didn't like, what I rated the book, and who I would recommend that book to. If you're new here and feel like sticking around, I would love to have you. Make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell notification to be notified every time I post a new video, because I post consistently, but not on a regular schedule. So if you want to know when I'm posting, then hitting the bell notification is the best way to keep track of my uploading. Without further ado, let's talk about my statistics for what I read in the month of February. I read a total of 16 books in the month. 15 of them were on audio, and one of them was an ebook. I did not finish any physical books this month, but that is all right. I do get through a lot more content audio-wise as I listen while I do my long commute for work, or while I'm doing chores, or while I'm exercising, things like that. So I tend to get through a lot more audiobooks, so that makes sense. If we break down the different genres that I read 6 romance books, I read 7 fantasies, I read 1 general fiction. It's listed as romance, but I feel like it's more of a general fiction. And then 2 listed as a historical fiction, but have a fantasy element to them that really skews the story, and I feel like is important to the plot. So while they're 2 historical fictions, they are definitely infused with fantasy. So they could be in the fantasy section, I guess. It's a little hard with these like genre blending type of books to know exactly where to put them. Some other statistics that I like to look at, I like to see when the books I read were published to see, I guess, how current or how relevant my reading is. So I actually read 3 books that were published in 2025, which is a lot for me. I am trying really hard to keep up on new releases and to like snatch up those audiobooks from my library as soon as I can so I can read what other people are reading and enjoying. I also read 4 books that were published in 2024. I read 7 books that were published earlier in the 2020s, so from 2020 up through 2023. I read 1 book published in the 2000s, in 2008, I think I remember. And then 1 book was published in 1937. I wonder which book that could be. It's The Hobbit. The longest book that I read this month was the 3rd Crescent City book. Which one is that? Oh man. I have the names all mixed up in my brain. House of Flame and Shadow. So I read House and Flame of Shadow, and that is 951 pages long. Too long. Books are too long. And then the shortest book I read was The Enemy by Sarah Adams, and this was 256 pages. So no novellas for me, but I read a handful that were on the shorter side as far as the like 250 to 350 type of range. Let's take a look at my goals for the year. So I have a list of 25 books I want to read in 2025 that are currently on my physical TBR shelf that I really want to prioritize getting them off of my shelf. And I read 3 books this month that fall into that category, which brings my total up to 4. So I am right on track to complete this goal this year. As far as total books that I got off my TBR shelves, this is all the physical books I have, but some of them I purchased after I read them because I really enjoyed them. There are 9 books up here that I pulled off of my TBR shelves and completed this month. A few of them I purchased this month as well, which is good, I feel like, to have a quick turnaround for the reads that you make, but I also purchased quite a few books this past month. We're not going to talk about that, but my overall goal is to have a net negative on my total TBR shelf, and I didn't accomplish that this month, but I'm not too far off from breaking even when it comes to the year as a whole, so I think that's still a totally reasonable goal. I also have a goal that I want to read more books by people of color, and I read 2 this month, and they were both new to me authors, which was really fun. I read, they were both romances, Highly Suspicious and Unfairly Cute by Talia Hibbert, and Flirting with Disaster by Naina Kumar, I think is how you pronounce her name. And then I also have a goal to read more classics intentionally, and I read 1 classic this month, which is The Hobbit. I don't have an average star rating for my month, but I do know I read one 5-star this month, and my lowest rated book was actually a 3-star, like 3-star even. I use Storygraph, and so I utilize the quarter-star ratings, 3 stars even, which means I liked it as much as I didn't like it, is kind of how that works in my brain. I read quite a few books in the like 3.75 to 4.25 star range, I feel like. So some pretty good books. Only one that really blew me away, but a couple others that I really enjoyed and I wasn't expecting to. Let's rearrange these books in order from what I read at the beginning of the month all the way down to what I read at the end of the month. And then we'll talk about all the books that I read this month. Okay, Alfred, you gotta get off my lap. Here is my fresh sack. My first read of February was actually a huge hit, and this was Anatomy, a Love Story by Dana Schwartz. And this is a YA historical fiction that takes place in the 1800s. This is one of the 2 books that had like a fantasy element or a paranormal element thrown in that really was such a small part of the story as a whole that I wish it didn't have that part of the story. Though continuing on in the series, I definitely see why that was the direction that the author chose. And it definitely became more significant for the duology as a whole. But in general, I really, really love this book. I rated it a 4.5 star. I love the historical aspect of it. I love learning about Hazel and her strong desire to become a surgeon in a time period when that really wasn't a possibility for her. She was willing to put herself at great social risk to be able to obtain her dreams. It felt really realistic, and it was so fun to learn about Hazel and her strong character. She was a very distinct character, and so I really loved how the author portrayed Hazel. I already mentioned the paranormal element that I didn't like as much, but also there was like a little bit of a mystery going on that was kind of tied to that paranormal element that was very predictable, like extremely predictable. And so seeing these characters not know what's going on, it was very obvious. But this is a YA, so it definitely has different storytelling goals than an adult book might. I thought this was a really well-written YA. I loved the gory parts of how surgery used to be in the 1800s, and it didn't bother me as much, but I know that some people might have a hard time stomaching some of the things that they did here because it was very true in a historical aspect to that. I immediately jumped into the second book in this duology, which is called Immortality, a Love Story by Dana Schwartz. And this one I did not like quite as much. I rated it a 3.75 star. In this book, Hazel has been, I guess, experiencing a surgical practice. Like, she's been treating some people and she is wrongly accused, put in jail, and then the king wants her to help his daughter, Queen Charlotte. And so that's kind of where the story takes you as she's trying to cure Charlotte. There's another love interest thrown in there, and I actually really, really liked him. I feel like the romance from the first book did not hold its same appeal in this book because of the paths that these characters took, of course. I was more on board with the new love interest to actually be the one that won Hazel's heart. Like, that's kind of what I was leaning towards. I kind of wanted her character growth to go that way, but it's a YA book, so it's kind of predictable on where it would end up. Like I said, that paranormal aspect of this duology was much stronger in this book. I still really love seeing Hazel's character and her distinct characterization in this book. But yeah, the story just was not quite as compelling for me. And again, I was rooting for Simon, not for Jack in this book. I did like him in the first book, but this book I felt much more distanced from him as far as a romantic interest goes. So you'll notice I don't have the second book. I honestly like this first book, Anatomy, more as a standalone than I did in the duology. And so I'm okay just having the first one on my shelves and referring people to it because the way it ended, it could just end right there. So I'm gonna leave it there, and maybe down the road, if I see a copy at my secondhand bookstore or at my thrift store or something, I might pick it up just to add to my shelf, but I don't feel like I need to buy the book because it wasn't my favorite, and I loved the first book just by itself. The next book I read was also not on my physical TBR. I had the audiobook for this, and this is the third Crescent City book by Sarah J. Maas, The House of Flame and Shadow. And I know this was a long anticipated book last year. I had not dove into Sarah J. Maas's work yet, and so I finally got around to finishing. This was my last book on SJM's backlist, so I'm really happy that I was able to tackle all these books in just a little bit over a year. This book I rated a 3.75 star. It definitely wasn't as compelling as the first couple. I think part of it was I really enjoyed the mystery element of the first two books as Bryce is trying to figure out what happened to her friend Danica, and also how that plays into the larger world and the Asteri, or these high-ranking creatures in their realm that are kind of the bosses of everybody. This book didn't really have the mystery element at all because you already got all the answers at the end of the second book, and so now Bryce is just trying to figure out what to do with that information and how to then defeat the Asteri and stop what they are doing to people's souls. I did take a break from reading this book and read the ACOTAR series because the way that book 2 ends in the Crescent City series, it has some tie-in to the ACOTAR characters, and so I felt like I would get more out of book 3 if I read ACOTAR first, and I honestly don't know if I would have gotten more out of it. I know a lot of people were not as happy with the crossover of this series. I honestly feel like it didn't really add to my experience having read ACOTAR before Crescent City 3 personally, but also ACOTAR is not my favorite. It's my least favorite of Sarah J. Maas's series. So do with that what you will. It jumps perspectives actually a lot. I think it jumped perspectives too much. It was really hard for me to keep track of what was going on. It just kind of just made the story kind of disjointed. I had a hard time feeling the need to continue on because things just kept getting interrupted and I could never finish a storyline and what was happening. So other than like the perspective switching a lot, there were some perspectives I really didn't like as much, like Varian, and I really did not like Ethan's perspective. I was just so tired of anytime it was his turn to tell his story. I loved Rune and Lydia's story, and I could have had that like the whole book and I would have been so happy. I loved the two of them. I loved their depth of their characters and how they kind of figured out what was happening between them and how their personal stories shaped the story at large. I love Rune and Lydia together. So I enjoyed this book. Definitely not as much as I enjoyed the other two books in the series, but I'll probably read more Sarah J. Maas. I'm waiting until the paperback book comes out so that this paperback matches all the rest of the books I have by Sarah J. Maas, which are in paperback, and I like my books to match. The next book that I read was With Love from Cold World by Alicia Thompson. And there's some things I loved about this book and some things I didn't really love, and that made it kind of hard to rate. I think I settled on a 3.5 star rating. I really loved the LGBTQIA plus representation and the depth of these characters and how they continuously got deeper throughout the book as we learned more and more about them. I really loved how these characters were written. In this book, there is an office worker and then just one of the regular staff at this attraction in Florida called Cold World that has like fake snow and like a snow globe type of a scenario. They are losing money. They might need to close soon. The owner of Cold World enlists Asa and Lauren to work together because Asa's been there for like 10 years and Lauren sees all the behind the scenes of like finances and organizational type things for this company, trying to figure out a way to make more money and to be more marketable so that they don't have to close right after the season. They are butting heads because they kind of don't see eye to eye, but there's definitely some chemistry there, and so you kind of see their relationship develop. I did feel like they were kind of immature and made some really silly decisions, like when they were stuck overnight in Cold World. I just didn't understand why they didn't resolve that issue. Like, it felt kind of contrived by the author. That didn't really make sense to me personally. I also felt like the relationship was a little bit unbalanced timeline-wise, considering that they were only dating for a week and then they had their like third act breakup, and then it was just kind of weird. It didn't fit quite right with like how these characters were feeling and how long they've been together and the magnitude of their breakup and why they broke. It just like, it didn't quite fit with how I would have liked the story to flow. I loved some parts about the story. Some parts really bothered me and didn't feel quite right. So I want to read more by this author before I make a final verdict on whether or not they are a romance author for me, but I would recommend this book because there were things that I really liked. The next book I read was The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. And this is actually my third time reading the book. I read it once individually, and I read it actually once with my husband when we were just dating. It was one of the books that we read while we were like hanging out in a hammock, enjoying the summer and just like spending time together. We don't really do that anymore, but we read a couple books that summer and this was one of them. And so this was my first time returning to it in 7 years. And it was really good to reread it, and knowing what I know from my previous reads and from watching the 3-part movie, I just really enjoyed it. It was an easy read because I knew exactly what was happening. And this is just such a good story. I like the whimsical tone that the author has. I love the complexity of Bilbo's character, and you see a lot from his perspective in this book compared to the movies that kind of look at everyone more as a whole. I do wish the side characters had more depth to them because Bilbo had a lot of depth and was a really interesting character as you saw his growth throughout the series as he came to own his role in this group. I do feel like the movies make all the side characters come alive a lot more, and they do add some things to some plot points, especially when it comes to the town on the lake and things like that. But in general, this is a really good story, and it was my preparation to then jump into the Lord of the Rings trilogy that I hope to get to this year as well. I rated this a 4.5 star. It's just a good story, and while there could be a little bit more in the depth of some of these side characters, I still feel like I really enjoyed myself and loved seeing Bilbo's journey. The next book I read was Sarah Adams' The Enemy, and this was one of the books that she published previously. I think this is my least favorite book of hers that I've read. I rated this just a 3 star, so again, I liked it as much as I didn't like it. I did have quite a few issues with it, though it was a cheesy, fun little romance read. It was far from my favorite. I think she did such a good job with the When in Rome series that going back and reading her backlist, I'm just not getting that same flavor that I loved from that series. I honestly found the main character kind of annoying and pretty immature with the way that she treated the male main character and the way that she saw him and the choices that he made in high school. I really also didn't like their lack of communication in the past, and he just seemed totally normal, but also kind of bland as a character. And she was just so off the wall. And while there were some things that she said that were really funny, there were other things that were just like way over the top. Like she was trying too hard to be comedic, and it just kind of got on my nerves a little bit. This is a really short read, which is nice. I think if it was longer, I would have hated it. But it was like a quick, fun, cheesy read that was definitely cringy, but also still kind of fun. I did feel like neither of these characters were super unique or stand out. So honestly, it's been 3 weeks since I've finished this book. I don't really remember much about it, which is not a good thing that it didn't stand out other than my general sentiments about the book. This next book is The Games Gods Play by Abigail Owen. Look at those sprayed edges. Ooh, the journey I went on to get this book. As soon as I finished this book and I was like, wow, I rated it a 4.5 star. I really am enjoying this book. I'm so excited for the second book to come out later this year. I want my books to match. I want the sprayed edges that I've seen around. I couldn't find them in any Barnes & Noble, Target, or Walmart, or indie bookstore within 100 miles of my house. Like, I'm not kidding. I called around, I visited stores, I looked online, I could not find this book. I managed to find it from Amazon from some, I think, indie bookstore that was selling this book. So I'm so glad I was able to find it so that I can have matching sprayed edges for when the second book comes out later this year. Like I said, I really enjoyed this book. It is a different type of modern day world where the Greek gods play a huge role in these characters' lives, and they do a competition, I can't remember how often, where each major Greek god and goddess pulls a human champion, and they compete because human lives are kind of disposable, so that the gods themselves are not wreaking havoc and destruction on the whole world during this competition as they're fighting to become the king of all the gods at this regular interval, like every 10 years or 100 years or something like that. Lyra gets selected by Hades, who has not participated in this competition before, and so they're just rocking the boat all over the place. I found this really refreshing because there was a lot of familiar things when it came to Greek mythology, but a lot of things that were pretty new to me as someone who is not a scholar on Greek mythology, but is pretty familiar with a lot of common tales. And so that was really fun to hear about different artifacts and different characters and relationships between the characters that I didn't know about before. It was just really fun and fresh. It was an easy to read book. It's definitely romantasy, but it leans more in the fantasy realm than in the romance realm. And while I do have some questions about these characters and their relationships, like why did Hades pick Lyra in the first place to be his champion, I feel like that's going to be answered more clearly later on in the series. And so I'm just really excited to like jump in and really enjoy this easy to read kind of a romantasy. The next book I read was Highly Suspicious and Unfairly Cute by Talia Hibbert. This is her first YA novel. I've never read her books before, though I have one other on my bookshelf by her that I would like to read. This is about two, I guess you could say, rivals in their high school who used to be best friends. They had a falling out a couple of years ago, and now they're gearing up for college applications and trying to get scholarships so that they can choose the life that they want as far as where to go to school and what to study and bigger goals like that too. They both decide to participate in a scholarship program that involves like camping and doing outdoorsy things, learning survival skills for a couple weeks out of the year, like during their school vacations. And as a result, they come closer again when they really haven't talked to each other in a couple years, and there's been some animosity between them, and you see them kind of understand each other's points of view and come together again. I loved these characters. They were very distinct. They had a lot of depth to them, and it was just so interesting getting to know these characters and where they came from. I really did not like, though, their relationship. It felt kind of fitting with YA, that they had a falling out and they never really talked about why that happened. But then it was just kind of frustrating for me that they didn't just like clear the air and understand each other from the get-go, especially from the girl's perspective. What's her name? Celine, especially from Celine's perspective, because she was just so against Brad as a whole. She was making a lot of assumptions when she could have just talked to him and understood him a little bit better. I also didn't really like how their relationship turned into like a friends with benefits thing, and they just refused to have good communication and conversation about like what they wanted from the relationship. That was just really frustrating to read about because they both wanted more. I don't know. It was just like really obvious that all they needed to do was have really good conversations, and then they would be in a much better place. Celine was also so self-sabotaging, but she had a lot of growth throughout this book. I think both of these characters did, which I really appreciated. Their depth, their growth, how distinct their characterization was. I definitely want to read more from Talia Hibbert, but this definitely wasn't my favorite. I rated it a 3.75 star. This was the one ebook that I read that I really enjoyed, and so I bought a physical copy. This is The Shadows Between Us by Tricia Levenseller, who is a local to me author, actually. And look at those stenciled edges, so fun. This book, it takes place in kind of like a Regency romance type of fantasy world where the king has this special shadow magic, and you're actually not allowed to touch the king. But our main character, Alessandra, has a goal to woo the king so that she can get close to him and then kill him so she can rule the kingdom. I love how morally gray both of these characters are, both Alessandra and the Shadow King. I loved how morally gray they both were. They just felt like a really good fit for each other, and it wasn't just they appear morally gray and then they're actually really good in private. Like, no, they were to their core morally gray people who were okay like killing people that got in their way and being kind of ruthless when it comes to ruling a kingdom. So yeah, I just felt like it was a really good fit for their characters, for their relationship. I really loved seeing that. I loved Alessandra's character and how she really wanted to work for her goals. She was really cunning, she was really brilliant, but she wasn't inherently like a cruel person. She just had some really intense goals that she was working towards. I did feel like the twist towards the end of the book was pretty predictable, and I also felt like the progression of the story was a little bit slow. Like I wanted a little bit more plot throughout it, but overall I really loved it, and I had such a good time every time I picked it up to read it. I rated this a 4.5 star. I'm excited to read the second book, though I didn't like the character that the second book is about when they appeared in this book, so I'm not sure how I'll feel about the second book, but we'll see how I feel about the next book in this series. I like that this is kind of a standalone story as far as the romance goes, and I just had a great old time. The next book that I read was The Hero of Ages, which is the final book in the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson, and I loved this book. I really enjoyed the Mistborn series, and there is like a second era of Mistborn that happens a few hundred years after this series, and so I'll get to that eventually. I'm trying to read through all of Brandon Sanderson's backlist. I really want to dive into the Cosmere, and so I have like a reading order that I'm reading through. So the first 3 Mistborn was first, and I think I'm reading Warbreaker next, and then I'm starting on The Way of Kings, I think is after that. So it's gonna be a long haul. It'll be more than this year, this project, to kind of go through all of his backlist, but I'm enjoying myself right now. So like I said, this is the 3rd book in the series. At this point, there is this deepness that is leading to the destruction of the world as they know it, and they can kind of see that this is happening. There's more ash from the sky, people are dying from the mist, and they're trying to find out what resources they have available to them that maybe the Lord Ruler left behind or that are found in ancient texts that might help them defeat this enemy that is really hard to quantify. This book surprisingly leaned a lot more religious than the other books in the series, but it felt like a natural progression of the way this trilogy went, and also the fact that you hear a lot more of Sazed's perspective in this book, since he was a purveyor of all things religion in prior books of the series. And so that was a really interesting thing to kind of see how that played a large role in this book. The relationships between people and ancient religions and the lore of religions and texts and how those thoughts shaped Sazed and others. It was just a really interesting discussion about religion as a whole, which was interesting. And I just appreciated that this book had different perspectives, different POVs than other books did in the series. And so it felt like a new and fresh book. I did wish that the conclusion had a little bit more meat to it, that it had a little bit more finishing it off, because it just felt like it ended so abruptly. And I seriously cried at the end of this book. There was so much going on. There was some heartache. It was a lot, but then it just kind of ended, and I wanted a little bit more time to see like the outcome of this final climax in the book and what happened after that. But I guess I'll probably get that in the next series, Mistborn, that happens hundreds of years later, but we'll see. I rated this a 4.75 star. I did not like it quite as much as The Final Empire, the first book in the Mistborn series, which was so good, but I liked it a little bit more than The Well of Ascension. The next book that I read was A December to Remember by Jenny Bayliss, and I rated this a 4.5 star. I actually really enjoyed this book. I had read a book by Jenny Bayliss for my holiday TBR reads video that I did in December for Vlogmas, and I didn't like that book as much, but I wanted to give her another chance, and this book I really enjoyed. It is about 3 different half-sisters. Their dad was a wanderer, should I say, and so 3 different half-sisters that all have the same father, and after he passes away, they are working together to fulfill his last wishes and to, I guess, reignite the Winter Solstice Festival that this little town that was his home base has had, and they haven't had it for a while, so they're trying to reorganize this festival. So that's where the December wintry vibes come in with the Winter Solstice Festival. Though while this is a really cozy read, it's not exclusive to December or the holidays, so I had just as fun a time reading it in February, and so I definitely recommend it as just a cozy read in general. This book, while it has subplots of romance for each of these 3 sisters that are all unique and well-shaped based on their life experiences, I felt like this book was more of a general fiction than a romance, because the main plot was these 3 sisters coming together, strengthening and growing in their relationships with each other, and then working together to make this Winter Solstice Festival happen. And then the subplots were just that, subplots. But there were 3 different romance subplots. So is this a romance? Is this a general fiction? You be the judge. I did find it kind of hard to keep these three sisters distinct in my brain and remember, okay, wait, which one's Maggie? Which one is Star? Like, it was just hard to keep track of them, even though each of these characters was very distinct individually. It was just hard to keep track of which one was which when they just shared names, just because we got so much information at the beginning on who these characters were. I really loved Star. She was the youngest sister, and I think Duncan was her love interest. I just loved seeing her come to find a really, really good person because she had had a string of not good people in her life. I really loved her story. Maggie, I think, was the oldest. I really did not like her story because she seemed the most capable of having a healthy relationship, and she just kept self-sabotaging, and her like climax of her subplot was definitely the biggest of the three. It had the most drama to it, which I feel like didn't quite fit her character in the story. But in general, I really loved this book. It was such a good cozy read, and I definitely recommend it. It honestly was so beautiful to see these characters come together and learn from their pasts and learn how to be sisters like they had been before they were adults. The next book that I finished was Scythe and Sparrow by Brynne Weaver. Look at this foil from the Barnes & Noble edition. And this book is the third book in the Butcher and Blackbird series. I think it's the Ruinous Love. Yes, the Ruinous Love trilogy. So Butcher and Blackbird is the first, and then Leather and Lark is the second book. This was my least favorite of this series. I rated this a 3.75 star. This book is about Fionn, who is the third brother, the youngest. He is the doctor figure, and Rose, who is a circus performer that you see in the other two books, kind of comes and goes in their lives, which is really funny in the other books. In this book, you see their relationship span from before, during, and even after the events of the other two books, which is kind of an interesting spread. And it kind of made the story a little less compelling because I kind of knew what was coming as far as like big points in the story because I'd seen them in the other books, if that makes sense. Though this book was definitely intended to kind of tie all three books together, and I think it did a pretty good job at tying all three books together. I love Rose's character. I found her really hilarious, and she was so fun to read about. Fionn was kind of bland, and his only like distinct thing was that while he is a doctor and he's trying to do good things, he kept talking about how he had this dark side and this violent side, and you never really saw that. Like, I don't know, it just felt like we were alluded to how dark he was and then he wasn't really. So I didn't really get the characterization that I think the author was trying to evoke. I wish there was a little bit more in that. I also felt like Rose as a character, it just didn't make sense that she was, you know, being the violent and murdery type because she's squeamish, which was really funny actually. But then also she's just kind of inept when compared to the two female characters in the other two books that are murdery. She just is not doing the same types of things. And so it's really surprising that it had been so long before she was found out and what she was doing. And so I had a hard time suspending my disbelief for that because you're already suspending your disbelief when it comes to serial killers and contract killers and things for this series. And so then having someone who is not proficient at what they're doing still not get caught, it just felt a little bit too much of a stretch for me personally. I did like how at the end of this book, Fionn and Rose were communicating via letters, and that was so, so sweet. And I wish that would have been integrated throughout the book because it was just a really, really sweet thing to see. I also wish that this book had more gore because that like morbid stuff is really what I thought was so fun about Butcher and Blackbird, which has been my favorite of the series. I'm gonna rearrange my books a little bit because even though I didn't read these next to each other, I'm gonna talk about them next to each other. This is Heartless Hunter and Rebel Witch, both by Kristen Ciccarelli. It's part of a duology, the Crimson Moth duology, and I've seen this book around. I've had it on my TBR, but I really wanted to get it from my library first, and I listened to it and I really had a great time. And I timed it well enough that I could listen to Heartless Hunter. Hi, love. He's fuzzy. I timed it really well that I could listen to the Heartless Hunter and then immediately listen to Rebel Witch. I kept saying the Heartless Hunter, the Rebel Witch. No, it's just Heartless Hunter and Rebel Witch. But I was able to get a Skip the Line loan for my library for Rebel Witch, and so it worked out timing-wise perfectly. In Heartless Hunter, there is a witch named Rune, and witches are banned in her society because recently there was an evil witch queen trio. They were all sisters and they were heinous. Since they were overthrown, now witches are illegal, and the Blood Guard is capturing all of the witches and executing them. So Rune is a witch in hiding, and she is trying really hard to capture those witches back and release them and set them free, send them to different countries so they can be safe. Gideon is the captain of the Blood Guard and is the hunter who is looking for her, the Crimson Moth, that he's seen evidence of her around but has not found her out. And you see in this like Regency-esque society where they are courting each other because she is looking for something he has to help release some witches, and he suspects her as the Crimson Moth. And so they're doing this dance of courtship to try to gain each other's trust so they can get what they want from each other, but they also are kind of falling in love. So I really love the premise of this story. I love the blood magic that these witches use and the scars that they have. And I just found that a really interesting premise. I rated this a 4.25 star. I found that there was some really good tension between these two characters, but nothing ever really got resolved until the end, when finally some walls were let down and it all blew up in their faces, right? It was really intense. The ending of this book, like, I could not put this down, and I definitely shed some tears. There were some really intense moments, though there were a lot of plot twists that I anticipated, and I saw them coming a long way off, but the ending really grabbed my attention and was really emotionally intense, and so it really kept me along for the ride, even though I had seen a big plot point from a mile away. I did feel like this Regency-esque era was also like just kind of incongruent. They talked about waking up and making coffee and things like that that just took me out of this time period, Regency-wise, and also took me out of this fantasy world. There were a lot of other moments like that. It wasn't just the coffee mention that just felt a little bit, incongruous with the way most of the story was told. It didn't feel quite as immersive as far as a historical fantasy type of a setting. And then while I read another book in between these two, I'm going to talk about Rebel Witch right now, which is the sequel in this duology. There is an evil witch who is trying to take over this country, and she's trying to gather an army, and Rune is helping her out, but has some qualms about what's happening. And so there's some really good tension internally as she's trying to figure out what to do right by her people, by the witches, but also not cause greater harm to other people as well. So kind of choosing the lesser of two evils, which was really an interesting aspect to learn about these characters, where you really see that conflict within Rune a lot more in this story. I didn't like this book as much. I rated this a 3.5 star. As a conclusion to this duology, it just kind of let me down a little bit. I definitely felt the same pull to keep reading. I was enthralled by it. I couldn't put it down, but I was just so frustrated by the miscommunication between these characters. And I understand there was threat of betrayal. They knew each other's goals, but they were still working together. That betrayal was overhanging them. But there were so many times when they made assumptions about each other that weren't vital to this tension of betrayal and trust that I feel like would have added layers to this relationship if things had come out. Like Gideon, the witch hunter, being like, "Oh, you loved my brother Alex." And she could have changed his mind about that. I don't know. There were some like simple things that I feel like would have been really easy for them to communicate about and to still have those layers of betrayal and trust. And it would have added more depth and more confusion to their relationship to have like developed trust in some ways, but still being unable to trust in other ways. And so I didn't really like that. It just was really frustrating to read about and them refusing to like address those assumptions. I also feel like this book would have been better if it was drawn out a little bit more and made into 2 books. So if this was a trilogy, I just feel like the lore and history of this world, we didn't really dive into it a lot in the first book. And so we got so much information in this book that it felt almost like the author wrote this book completely after writing the first one and didn't have an idea where the second book was going until after the first one was already done. There weren't enough tie-ins with the story in the first book to like the lore and the history and the magic that was exposed in this book. I just feel like the continuity wasn't quite there. And if this had been a trilogy, it would have been easier to see kind of that that lore, that history, that magic build up throughout the second book and then lead into what's happening in the third book, if that makes sense. I also feel like this book was even more predictable than the first one as far as like plot twists and what was going to happen between the characters. And so it didn't keep me as excited or on my toes as the first book did. The next book I want to talk about is Ready or Not by Cara Bastone, and it was my favorite book of the month. I rated this a 5-star. So good. It definitely feels similar to an Emily Henry or an Abby Jimenez book in that the characters are so real and human, but also so lovable. I loved how distinct these characters were, and especially the love interest, Shep. He is like a derpy, gangly kid that loved computer stuff growing up, and he didn't just turn into some sexy hunk that you see in every single romance. He was still very distinct and so lovable, but not like immediately like attractive from a like visual standpoint. He was still really attractive. He didn't fit that mold of what a love interest looked like, and I loved that he had a unique personality and unique look to him that made it so easy to see him in my mind's eye and just fall in love with him too. And I absolutely love Friends to Lovers. This was beautiful. Eve has an unexpected pregnancy, and she's trying to navigate her job, her best friend who has been trying to get pregnant for a while. She's trying to navigate her baby daddy and like that relationship as, you know, Ethan is panicking and having some personal struggles with that. And then she's also growing in her relationship with Shep, who is her best friend's brother, and just seeing the growth of Eve and these other characters, how distinct these side characters were, and their own growth throughout the course of her pregnancy. It was just so beautiful and real and heartwarming. It makes you see humanity in a lot of different forms. And I feel like these side characters were not just distinct, but had a lot of depth, and they added depth to Eve because of those side characters. They weren't one note, which you see in a lot of romances, I feel like. So this was so well written. I loved this book. It was so heartfelt. And as someone who is a mother, it felt so relatable from a pregnancy standpoint, even though these relationships that Eve has are very different than the relationships that I have with my daughter, with my husband, with my friends, things like that. It just was so beautifully written and something really special. And I think she has another book coming out like next week. And so I'm so excited to pick that up and to read her next book. The last book that I read in the month was Flirting with Disaster by, I think her name is pronounced Naina Kumar. It's not Nina, it's not Nana. It's somewhere in between, pronunciation-wise. This is a second chance romance between Mina and Nikhil, who were friends, dating pretty early on in their relationship. They got married, and then fast forward like 7 years in the future, and they haven't lived together since around 1 year's being married. So they've been separated for 6 years, and now she's finally getting a divorce with him so she can move her career forward as far as becoming a politician, moving out of the lawyer space and becoming a politician and moving forward in a different relationship. But she gets stranded in, I think it's Houston, because of a hurricane that hits. And so you see them weather the hurricane together. There's some really awkward tension between these two characters. These characters are just so unique and vivid that I really loved reading about them and learning from them. And while their lack of communication was very bothersome to me, it felt very realistic and relatable, and the tension was just so palpable. It was very well written. I'm not convinced that these characters have the relationship tools that they need to communicate and keep this relationship alive once they've rekindled, because there was so much miscommunication and lack of communication, honestly, from the first like year of their marriage and how it dissolved to then 6 years of basically no contact to then trying to get a divorce, but then things are rekindling. There was just a lack of communication that really needed to happen so that they could be able to trust each other and learn from each other and like work together as a partnership. That honestly, with a really fast moving relationship that, you know, you get married really, really quick, you have those growing pains, and they never really grew from it in their first year of marriage. And I just wish there was a little bit more details on how they overcame that towards the end of this book as they were rekindling their relationship. Because she had some really great emotional intelligence and communication with this other guy that she was talking to. And so they could do it. I just wasn't seeing it as much. And so I really wish there was more that, because that was a huge issue with their relationship previously. And so I wasn't entirely convinced that they wouldn't have another falling out after the epilogue of this book, if that makes sense. But I loved these characters. I felt like they were so real. I loved their depth. And while their arguments were bothersome and frustrating to read about, they felt very realistic. I rated this a 4.25 star. Also, the hurricane aspect was really unique, and it sounded like almost everything was believable and realistic when it came to hurricane prep and writing out a hurricane. There was a couple small things that I was like, is that real? Overall, I did really enjoy this book, and I definitely want to read more from this author. There you have it. All 16 books that I read in the month of February. Quite a good spread, and I was really excited to read through some of these books that I had had in mind to get through for a while. If you haven't seen my short here on my channel, I shared the 10 books on my physical TBR that I really hope to read in the month of March. So let me know what you are planning to read in this next month, and if you've read any of these books, what you think about them. I love to hear your perspectives on the things that I'm reading, and if you have any recommendations for me, because I read a wide variety of books, and I would love to hear some of your favorites that you think I would like. Until next time, happy reading. Bye!